So when the news broke, the color rushed from their faces and their stomachs went queasy. Because yet again it happened. Another crash, another death. And this is what the folks at General Motors were facing with their expanding ignition switch defect that plagued the company, causing heads to roll, people losing their jobs, lives lost, and stock price crashed. You probably heard about the GM ignition switch problem. It made international news. And of course, it was one of the worst crises the company has faced since its founding over 100 years ago. And this problem was big. This particular defect caused 124 deaths, 275 injuries. And from a financial perspective, it was equally devastating. 30 million vehicles recalled and over $2.5 billion in settlements and fines. And not to mention the loss of trust it had on its customer base, shareholders, and the public at large. And this was the giant problem that Mary Barra had to face within just 2 weeks of taking the helm of one of the largest corporations in the world. And as the newly appointed CEO, she knew she had to do something different. When she started to investigate the challenges, what she discovered was remarkable. That yes, this particular challenge was caused by a design defect in an ignition switch. But the real problem, the root of the problem, was a poor management of conflict. It was the unwillingness to take conflict head on by executives leading up to that time, or at times the overuse of conflict in casting blame and running from responsibility. While the ignition switch was a technical problem, the root cause was a cultural problem. General Motors had failed to embrace, understand, and leverage conflict to drive progress. Well, when Mary Barra took over, things changed. First, she stood up, she took responsibility, and she said, "This stops with me right now." And then she looked conflict right in the face and took on the challenges that needed to be conquered and didn't engage in childish schoolyard fights like others. And she took this as an opportunity to reinvent the company and its brand and reestablish trust with the American people. Mary Barra was able to master conflict and in turn drove tremendous value for the company. Today, General Motors is performing at extraordinary levels, reaching new heights in shareholder value and profitability. And all of this was done at the heart by Mary taking on conflict, leveraging it, and using it to drive progress. And by the end of our time here together today, you'll see it just as clearly as I do. Now, of course, it's not just General Motors. Conflict happens everywhere in all walks of life. Many years ago, I was an executive at a company called ePrize, and we had just negotiated a great deal with FedEx, and we wanted to get their signature on the contract while the iron was still hot. So the salesperson had her admin overnight the contracts to FedEx so that they could sign them and send them right back to us. And the admin sent the contract to FedEx using UPS. Now, I'm not making this up. This really happened. And we were thinking about the time. We pictured the UPS truck pulling up into FedEx headquarters parking lot. The driver gets out. He's got his brown shorts on, his hat, his clipboard. And as he's walking up to the front door of the building, we were wondering, is he worried like he might get into a fight once he gets inside? But needless to say, understandably, FedEx was very offended, and this almost derailed the deal. But we worked really hard to get it back on track and ultimately had a good relationship with them. But sometimes things don't work out. Some cultures, whether they be cultural, whether they be industrial, political, or otherwise, are more prone to conflict than others. Now, basketball in the United States has become one of the nation's most popular pastimes. And while these sports rivalries can get out of hand from time to time, for the most part, it's all in good fun. But basketball in Lebanon has become heavily entrenched in sectarian division. These athletic contests have become proxies for mounting political and religious rivalries. The situation got so bad that when the top two teams played each other, games ended in riots. Fans stayed at home. And as the situation got so bad, players, fans, and financiers left the sport. And while the basketball league in Lebanon still exists today, there's a real question as to whether it'll ever return to its previous glory. And sometimes we may find ourselves in a business interaction with a client or our colleague or even our boss, and we feel like we're in the Lebanese basketball league. Now, they let conflict become their downfall, but we don't have to let that happen. What if we could make conflict work for our benefit and not against us? Now, we got to ask, like, why is conflict so hard? I mean, we know we should be better at it, but many of us just never figure a way out of it. And there's no class in school for it. And think about it. We spend literally months in elementary school learning how to do long division, a skill we never use, at least not since a calculator was invented. Yet we spend zero time on managing conflict, which is a skill we could all use virtually every day of our lives. But the good news is that there are some simple, straightforward things we can do to dramatically improve our conflict management skills. So, question: how many people wake up in the morning looking for conflict, hoping to encounter it throughout the day? Well, I can't see the audience, but usually no one's raising their hand, or maybe there's one or two. And let's take a look at why. First off, we are socialized from a very young age to sugarcoat feedback, soften bad news. We're told, if you don't have anything nice to say, don't say anything at all. We've been trained to avoid conflict. And we've got over 1 billion years of evolution hard-coded into our genes. We've been bred to avoid conflict. We have something called the amygdala. It's actually 2 glands on either side of the brain behind the optic nerves. And they're designed to detect threats and prepare the body for an emergency response. When we perceive a threat, the amygdala sounds the alarm. The stress hormones like adrenaline, cortisol flood our system. We notice immediate changes like an increased heart rate or sweaty palms. Our breathing becomes rapid and shallow as we take in more oxygen, preparing us to bolt if we have to. And we notice other sensations like a quivering in our chest, limbs, or voice. We may feel heat flush our face, our throat constrict, the back of our neck tighten, our jaw set. We're in the grips of this highly efficient but prehistoric set of physiological responses. And they're not exactly pleasant. They're not designed for relaxation. They're meant to move us to action. And the amygdala also shuts down the neural pathways to the prefrontal cortex, the part of our brain where complex decision-making takes place, so we can become disoriented in a heated discussion. And we lose access to multiple perspectives. And as our focus narrows, we can get trapped in the one perspective that makes us feel most safe. I am right, you are wrong. And if that weren't enough, our memory becomes untrustworthy. Have you ever been in an argument with a friend or loved one and you literally can't remember one positive thing about this person? It's as if the brain dumped the memory function altogether just to survive the threat. Instead, we're simply filled with the flashing red light of the amygdala that says, danger, react, danger, protect, danger, attack. We can't choose how we want to react because our genetically bred nervous system does it for us. And all this happens before our conscious mind even realizes what's going on. It is ridiculous. Now, when I say we've been bred to protect ourselves, it's because when our ancestors walked out of a cave and saw a saber-toothed tiger, their amygdala kicked into high gear and protected them from the threat. Now, there were others at the time that had less active amygdala. They walked out of the cave and said, oh, a saber-toothed tiger. Cool. Well, those weren't our ancestors. The official scientific term for guys like that was lunch. He didn't live long enough to procreate and pass his weak amygdala gene on to future generations. Now, in modern times, one of the most common sources of conflict is poor communication. People say, well, just communicate better. That's a lot easier said than done. When you're dealing with somebody who's really entrenched in a position, it's hard to get them to see things from our point of view, especially if poor communication triggered that fight or flight reflex. Instead, they may be trapped in the one perspective that makes them feel most safe. I am right, you are wrong. Now, one of the reasons that this is so challenging is that, again, you have the combination of nature and nurture. So, how are these stories valuable to us? Well, in the same way that General Motors and others were able to master conflict, we can do the same. It can drive meaningful results in our companies, for our clients, and even our communities. And in fact, the lack of understanding of conflict and how people take it on, either too much or too little, can be the explanation to why some companies rise and others fall, and why some careers are spectacular and others are underachievements. And by mastering this, what may seem as a less apparent issue, it can fuel incredible success for all of us. Now, as somebody who's been studying conflict for almost 30 years, I can tell you this firsthand. Now, I first became involved in managing and leveraging conflict many years ago when I was a trial lawyer, investigating the sources of conflict in my cases, the personalities involved, the different communication styles, and how they worsened or improved the situation, where it was my job to diffuse conflict in a settlement negotiation or really amp it up in a court hearing. And I then took those same skills to join a small startup and help it grow to a large, successful company and ultimately a great exit. And went on to negotiate business and venture capital deals in the hundreds of millions of dollars. And I've had the opportunity to explore conflict from all sides, too much, too little, when to run and when to take it on. And what I've discovered is that there is actually a systematic way that we can leverage conflict for good. It's a proprietary process I've developed through years of study with both academic research and practical experience into how conflict can be harnessed for good. So whether some of us may fear conflict or some of us love a good fight, there is a systematic way for us to leverage conflict to drive better outcomes for our companies, for our clients, and those we care most about. And that's what I'm excited to share with you today. So let's dive in and take a hard look at the sources of conflict, how to diffuse and leverage it, and together, let's learn how to rise above these challenges to achieve greatness. So let's take a look at the 5 danger traps of conflict as a mechanism not to encounter adversity, but rather to savor success. So the first trap is the bully trap. Some of you probably understand what this is, also called the anger trap. So question, what do you do when someone who is excellent at their craft, at the top of their game, is pressuring you into doing something you're not comfortable with, perhaps even dangerous? Well, Quentin Tarantino is an award-winning director, and Uma Thurman is an award-winning actress. And they've made several movies together, including the Kill Bill series. And in a scene that appears toward the end of Kill Bill 2, Uma Thurman's character is speeding down a dirt road in a convertible, and the camera's mounted on the back of the car, and you see her hair blowing in the wind as she drives along. Well, on the day of shooting this scene, Uma Thurman was not comfortable driving. A crew member told her the car wasn't safe. It had been converted from a stick shift to an automatic, and the seat wasn't screwed down properly. And she asked if a stunt driver could do the shot instead. She said when Tarantino found out, he came to her trailer and he was furious. He said she was costing them time and money. He assured her the car was safe, and he said all you have to do is drive down a straight stretch of road. But he said, make sure you hit 40 miles per hour, otherwise your hair won't blow the right way, and I'll make you do it again. Well, against her better judgment, she did the shot. And as we can see from the raw footage taken that day, the road wasn't straight. And she struggles with the steering wheel, trying to keep the car on track as it drifts off the road and ultimately smashes into a palm tree. Talk about negative conflict. She suffered a concussion and permanent injuries to her neck and her knees. Now, this was a tough situation. Tarantino is an excellent director, passionate about his craft, and he has the forceful type of personality that you need to get things done in Hollywood. But it was that same personality trait that was at play here today, or here on that day. It's the bully trap, the anger trap. Now, obviously, Tarantino would never let her have gotten behind the wheel of that car if he thought there was a chance she could get hurt. And this in no way was Uma Thurman's fault, but there were other options here. They could have used a stunt double, and Tarantino could have driven the car first to make sure it was safe, but none of those were explored because they had fallen into the bully trap. So one of the lessons we can glean from this story is that it's okay for certain things to be non-negotiable when it comes to your comfort level. Now, most of us aren't put in physically threatening situations, but there are times when some of us may feel professionally threatened. And more often than not, the people putting us in those situations don't intend for harm to come to us. Of course, if they do, my advice is get as far away from those people as fast as possible. But most of the time, we can diffuse these situations by dispassionately making people aware of our concerns. I'm going to say that again. We can diffuse these situations by dispassionately making people aware of our concerns. I know you want the shot done a certain way, but I don't feel comfortable. A crew member told me that the car isn't safe. Can we at least explore another option? One area where I've seen the bully trap do tremendous damage is in leaders giving feedback to their team members, especially when one of them made a mistake. I've seen negative cultures in companies that literally takes the stock price down over time. It truly affects the bottom line in giving poor feedback. Now, here's the thing. When we have to give feedback, we should never use it to beat up on somebody. And if you think that making someone look like an idiot by yelling at them in front of their peers is exactly what they need to advance in their careers, you're wrong. In fact, you're not even qualified to lead people, and you should never be entrusted with the management of other human beings. Let me back off. I didn't mean it. I just did it for effect. But how did that make you feel? I mean, no one wants to be spoken to that way. And if I had kept going in about 5 more seconds, the energy would have turned really negative, and most of you probably would have just tuned me out, switched over to YouTube. So you shouldn't use feedback to beat up on somebody. Now, there are times when people on our teams are going to make mistakes, and we do need to give feedback. But one rule is no venting. If we're angry about something, we need to go process that anger first before we give the feedback, so that when we do give it, we're not coming from an emotional place. I like to use what I call a shopping list voice. So let's say that I'm on the phone with a client who's terminating their agreement with my company because one of my people screwed up. So I slam down the phone and I march over to that person in front of everybody else. I say, hey, I just got off the phone with the client. They said you sent them deliverables with a bunch of mistakes in them, and they had to redo all your work, and they missed a deadline as a result. They also said this isn't the first time you've done this. So guess what? They fired us. That's right. That's a $2 million a year account that's no longer a client to this firm because you can't figure out how to do your job. And Sally, who's the salesperson on this deal, is super pissed off because she now has to figure out how she's going to fill a $2 million hole in her sales target for the year. So I suggest you apologize to her and get your head out of your ass. And scene. Wouldn't it be fun to work with me? So that may be a very cathartic process for me. It may be healthy for me to sort of just unleash all that anger so I don't carry it around with me after that, but that's not giving good feedback. That's just me being a jerk. And that's me actually being a very bad leader and creating a culture where conflict goes very negative. So I talked about the shopping list voice. If someone says to me, hey, Gabe, I'm going to the store. Do you want me to pick you anything up? I say, sure, I want to make a cake. So could you pick up some eggs, milk, flour, sugar, frosting, and some sprinkles? Shopping list voice. It's dispassionate. It's matter of fact. Apply that to this situation. I just got off the phone with a client. They said you sent deliverables with mistakes in them, and they had to redo your work. They also said it's not the first time you've done this, and they've terminated our agreement. And that's a $2 million a year account that we just lost. And Sally is upset because she now has to figure out how she's going to make up a $2 million shortfall in her sales target for the year. So I think it would be good to apologize to her. And my advice is, when you do have to give negative feedback and it's really negative like that, because you can't not tell the person, use it as an opportunity to reaffirm the person. And you can say things like, look, let's not sugarcoat this. This is horrible. But you're not horrible. You're actually a smart, very capable person who has a great future ahead of you if you want it. And my hope for you is that this incident is the turnaround point in your career. And that 6 months from now, people will look back on this and say, wow, he really screwed that up. But you know what? Ever since then, he's had a great attitude. He's been delivering high quality product. And I actually look forward to working with him on a project in the future. And that would be an example of overcoming the bully trap, the first danger trap. The second danger trap is the need to win trap. This is needing to win for winning's sake. So when I walked into Judge Morcom's courtroom, it seemed like the only sound in the world was my heart pounding through my chest. And that was the adrenaline pumping through my veins because I was there to do battle. And this was the moment I had been working toward for years. This was my opportunity to step up to my calling, to achieve justice, to serve my client. This was my opportunity to win. Now, that was over 25 years ago, but I remember it like it was this morning. And the case was simple enough. My client, who was a single mother of 3, was driving down the road when a bus swerved into her lane, banged into her car, didn't do much damage, but it forced her off the road headfirst into a telephone pole. And the bus didn't even stop. It just kept on going. And that accident left my client partially disabled with a future filled with surgeries and pain. It had dramatically made her life worse, and she needed my help. So I took her case, and I worked the hell out of it. I subpoenaed records. I deposed witnesses. I even tried to track down the bus to match up damage on the bus to the damage to her car. But the bus company denied that the accident happened, and the bus driver testified at his deposition that he didn't even remember that day. And I heard one of the biggest law firms in town. They had more money, more lawyers, and more resources than I had. In fact, all I had was the word of my client. I was seriously outgunned, and it was not looking good. But then I found it, a smoking gun, buried under the thousands of pages of documents they threw at me, was the log sheet for the bus that day, written in the bus driver's own handwriting. And if you've ever seen emotion translated into the written word, this was it. And that emotion was anger. This guy was mad. At the top of the page, in all caps, the pen almost was cutting through the paper. It said, "This was supposed to be my day off," underlined with 3 exclamation points. "This is an overloaded route with too many rowdy passengers. Per dispatch, pedal to the metal, back to station." That last entry was written 6 minutes before the accident, and the log sheet showed that the bus was in the exact location of the accident at the precise time that the accident happened. This was it. I was going to win. And haven't we all been in a situation where we thought we had gained the upper hand on the person across from us? Now, our plan was to keep quiet, not let on that I'd found the log sheet. I was pretty sure the other lawyer didn't even know it existed. I was going to wait for the bus driver to deny the accident on the witness stand in front of the jury. I had set a trap, and I was going to spring it on them in a moment of courtroom glory that most lawyers only even dream of. So there I was. I was in Judge Morcom's courtroom, ready to lay waste to my opponents. That's a picture of Judge Morcom later in life. But little did I know, something that had happened more than 30 years earlier was about to dramatically impact the next 20 minutes of this case. So back in 1964, Claudia House Morcom wasn't a judge. She was a young African-American attorney who went down to Mississippi with a group of other young lawyers to help civil rights workers who were getting in trouble with local law enforcement. So they were down there registering black people to vote, and the local sheriffs didn't take too kindly to those efforts. Now, those are details for another story, but suffice to say, it was an ugly time in American history, and it was a dangerous time for civil rights workers. As it turns out, my father was one of those young lawyers with Judge Morcom down in Mississippi, and that group together, they formed a bond with each other that could only be forged in such extreme circumstances. Now, fast forward several decades later, I had no idea of the shared experience that she had with my dad, but I believe that's the reason she was about to save me from myself. Like any good judge, she called the lawyers into her chambers to see if there was a chance we could settle the case before we started picking a jury. And when the judge got me alone, she proceeded to tell me that I had a weak case, and she couldn't understand why I hadn't accepted their settlement offer. So I took a chance, I tipped my hand and showed her the log sheet. Well, she then called the other lawyer in and said, "You got to increase your offer." And the other lawyer said, "Your Honor, I don't believe this accident even happened." And the judge said, "Well, I believe it happened. And I believe he is going to convince a jury that it happened." And then she proceeded to lean on this lawyer like I've never seen a judge lean on a lawyer before. In fact, at one point, she even picked up her phone and said, "Do you need me to call your client and get more authority for you?" Well, ultimately, they offered more than 10 times their initial offer. But I sat smugly back and said, "Well, I'll relay this to my clients as I'm required to do, but this isn't enough money." And then the judge asked the other attorney to excuse us for a second time. And she gets me alone and she says, "What the hell do you think you're doing?" I said, "Judge, they hurt my client. They lied about it, and then they covered it up. And now they think they can get away with it just by throwing a few extra bucks at her? No, I can win this case. I'm going to expose this injustice for what it is. I'm going to expose them for who they are." And she said, "I do not need you to lecture me about injustice, young man. They just offered your client more money than she's ever dreamed of. Money that's going to change her life and the lives of her children. And you're going to go ahead and gamble that at trial? Your job is to achieve the best result you can for your client. And I'm telling you, you just done it." And in that moment, I realized conflict had gotten the best of me. I was so focused on winning that once I actually possessed the power to do it, I wasn't willing to accept a really good settlement that was in the best interest of my client. I would only accept their defeat at trial. Now, yeah, I had the log sheet, but going to trial was always risky and would have been reckless in that situation and could have cost my client everything. I was just lucky that the judge was there to save me from myself because I had fallen into one of the danger traps of conflict. I needed to win for winning's sake. Now, one of the lessons from this story is that emotion is a weakness that can take conflict into unproductive, even destructive territory. And the irony is, many of us use emotions like anger and self-righteousness to build ourselves up into feeling powerful, when the very thing that gives us our power can be our greatest weakness. So the next time, well, I should say this, we are all hardwired for that fight or flight response to conflict. And when you're in the jungle, those responses will save your life. But when you're at the negotiating table or in a business interaction, emotion will drive an extremely poor use of conflict. So the next time that you feel the physiological effects of conflict, the hair on the back of your neck stands up, your heart rate starts to pick up, stop, take a beat, ask yourself, am I falling into one of the danger traps of conflict? Is the person I'm dealing with falling into one? Merely asking that question will pull you out of an instinctive response and into intellectual awareness. And that will give you power and control. Here's a negotiating tip. Catering to your own ego is costly, but catering to someone else's ego is free. If you find yourself dealing with someone whose ego is driving the conflict, then feed that person's ego. It will cost you nothing. Just recognize that that person has a need to feel powerful. So tell him he's powerful and respectfully ask him that he not use his power to hurt you. Of course, put that in your own words. Those are ways to overcome the first danger trap of conflict, the need to win trap. Sorry, that was the second trap. The third trap is the liar's trap. So Panama City Beach, Florida, national restaurant chain, chicken wings, Hooters. Now, I'm sure everybody has heard about the Hooters restaurant chain, but what some of you may not know is that down in Florida, they ran a beer sales contest. One morning, the manager gets everybody together. They gather around and says, all right, today we're going to have a beer sales contest. Whoever sells the most beer at the end of the day is going to get a brand new Toyota. It's going to be out in the parking lot. So the lunch crowd starts shuffling in and everybody gets to work. And they start pushing the beer. And one woman named Jody starts really pushing the beer and she's selling it. She's doing a really good job. In fact, Jody sold more beer than anyone had ever sold in a single shift at that location before. So at the end of the shift, they all kind of gather around, they add up the sales receipts and they determine Jody is the winner. So they blindfold her and they walk her out in the parking lot. And then when they take off the blindfold, there in the parking space is a brand new toy Yoda doll from Star Wars, the toy Yoda. And they all laugh and they think it's funny, but not Jody. That's actually her. She's not laughing. She actually looks pretty upset. And she was so upset, she quit. And she went to a lawyer, told him the story. And he thought it was hilarious. He thought it was so funny, he filed a lawsuit. Faced with the lawsuit, Hooters at first, they tried to dismiss it. They said, well, wait a second. We didn't ask her to do anything that wasn't required as part of her job. She's a waitress. She's supposed to sell beer. And the judge says, no, you made an offer. She accepted it. It's a contract. You're going to a jury. And they said, well, hold on. We said Toyota. It's not our fault she misheard us and thought we said Toyota. And the judge says, well, you know what? You can make that argument to the jury, but you may want to explain why you would put a Yoda doll in a parking space. Well, rather than have their fate decided by a jury, they agreed to settle. And while the terms of settlement are confidential, Jody's lawyer publicly stated that she got enough money in the settlement to go to a Toyota dealership where she could pick out any car in the lot that she wanted. Now, one of the lessons from this story, and this first one is pretty obvious, don't lie, don't humiliate people. Hopefully we were taught that when we grew up. But we can see how when you overgain things, it can really backfire. And in this case, Hooters really got itself in a lot of hot water. I mean, imagine if they had just given to the car. They would have spent far less money on a new car than they ultimately spent on legal fees, negative PR, and of course, a new car. But think if they had given Jody that car. They still could have done their silly joke with the Yoda doll, and then everybody could turn around and the parking space behind everyone was the real car. Jody would have driven that car to work every day, parked it in front, and it was sat there as a symbol for everyone else to see hard work really pays off, that this is an organization that cares about its people and invests in them. Jody would have become the greatest ambassador for that restaurant in the community. But instead, they ran a contest that was expressly designed to humiliate their best employee, the one who could outsell all others. That's one of the things that are going to happen when you fall into the liar's trap. The fourth trap is the avoidance trap. Now, earlier, we talked about General Motors. That was bad. And we saw how, while that began as a design defect, because of the company's failure to confront conflict head on, it spiraled and escalated into a terrible crisis. That was a corporation with a severe aversion to conflict avoidance, one of the danger traps of conflict. We talk about fight or flight. This is flight. This is the flight reflex. And the real tragedy is that there was a handful of people inside General Motors who knew for more than 10 years that they were putting defective ignition switches into cars, but they didn't say anything because of the culture. And sadly, stories like this aren't new. Certainly in product recalls, things like this eventually come out all the time. So how does that happen? I mean, these ignition switches literally killed people. So how is it that otherwise compassionate human beings could turn a blind eye to it? The answer is the flight reflex. People instinctively run from conflict. In fact, most people will run away from a small conflict that's immediate, even if it sends them running directly toward a much larger conflict that's not immediate. It's not rational, it's instinctive. And in organizations that discourage bad news or even contradictory opinions, the amount of energy and effort and courage it takes to sort of raise a red flag and speak up, to buck up against that system, to swim upstream against that current is far greater than the energy to just keep your mouth shut, keep your head down, and hope for the best. And the larger the organization, the more magnified the problem because the more energy is required. And it feels safer to hide in larger crowds. And also, if things do go bad, you think, well, there's many more people to spread the blame across. Now, of course, none of this withstands rational thought, but don't underestimate the power of defense mechanisms. Now, here's the thing. If it requires that we're superhuman or we have to muster up these Herculean levels of strength to overcome this, then we're all doomed because that's too much for us mere mortals. The good news is that there are some simple, straightforward things that can be done to make this rather easy. So culturally, how do you combat conflict avoidance? Well, I had the honor of meeting Matt Bissonette, who was a member of SEAL Team 6 during the Osama bin Laden raid. And he later went on to become the leader of SEAL Team 6. And he said something interesting. He said, you people in the business world suck at communication. And then he told a story about his first mission as team leader of SEAL Team 6. He said they were in the middle of the mission, and his commanding officer, who was at some air base 100 miles away, comes over his radio and says, hey, we're checking in for status. We want to know when to send in the helicopters to come pick you up. Matt responds back, looks like we'll be wrapping up in about 10 minutes. So send them in then. God knows where they were or what they were doing, but you can rest assured it was some badass SEAL team stuff. Well, Matt thinks to himself, you know what? I'm going to check in with my new guy, make sure he's got his ladder. Apparently, this mission required the use of a ladder. So he radios the new guy and says, hey, we're going to be wrapping up in 10 minutes. I just want to make sure you have your ladder. New guy radios back. Yes, I have it. They complete the mission, go back to base. And then they have what's called, after every mission, they have a debrief meeting. They talk about what went well, what didn't go well. And at the end of this meeting, they carve out time for anyone to say anything they want. New guy raises his hand. He says, I got a question. Why'd you radio me with 10 minutes left to go and ask me if I had the ladder? And Matt's first thought was, because I'm the leader of SEAL Team 6 and I'll ask you whatever the hell I want and you will answer it. But he didn't say that. Instead, he gave more of a blow-off answer. He says, hey, no, I didn't mean anything by it. It's just We were wrapping up. I wanted to make sure everybody had their gear and then we'd be ready to go. But the new guy didn't let it go. He said, that ladder weighs 70 pounds, and I had to carry it running through the mountains for 2.5 hours on the way to this mission. Did you think I was just going to forget I didn't have this heavy, cumbersome thing that I was responsible for? I didn't ask you if you forgot your assault rifle. And right there, Matt realized he was micromanaging, and that was not good leadership. And he said it's a good thing that guy brought it up because those things can become habit forming. Had the new guy not said something, it could have been that every mission after that, with 10 minutes left to go, Matt would have radioed him asking if he had his ladder. And every single time it would have pissed that guy off and resentment would have mounted and mounted. Now think about it. If you're going into battle and literally putting your life in someone else's hands, do you want that person to resent you? So these are Navy SEALs, but this is a great mechanism that can and should be incorporated into any culture. This is a process that requires the initiation of conflict. Now, the military is typically a top-down command and control organization. Questioning a superior officer requires a lot of strength and courage. But these are Navy SEALs. And they know that in order to be able to operate together as a team, they have to be able to question one another, to confront one another, to openly contradict one another in front of an audience. And they simply cannot afford to operate in a culture that requires strength and courage merely to speak one's mind. Same thing in business. The stakes are a little lower sometimes, but in the case of General Motors, they were equal. It was life or death. We can incorporate this process into the ordinary workflow, have a regularly scheduled debrief meeting, or carve out time for debrief in a meeting that's already happened. This is a meeting where people are required to raise issues, get things off their chest, call out problems, where people aren't doing their job if they remain silent. Doing this accomplishes 3 goals. 1, the recurring nature of these meetings gives the organization an opportunity to uncover problems on a regular basis. Bad news will surface faster. 2, because it's a job requirement, it frees people from the social stigma of being associated with initiating conflict. No one has to worry about being that person who's always raising conflict. It's required. And 3, it motivates and empowers people to continually seek improvement. And in fact, in addition to a debrief, do a pre-brief before embarking on a project. Gather everybody into a room and say, let's assume we do this project and we fail. Why would that happen? What would have led to that? People are free to talk about things that otherwise they'd feel very self-conscious about raising because they're not talking about issues that have actually happened. They're just confronting things that they see elsewhere in the organization that may happen in the future. Organizations that remain committed to this endeavor, they have cultures of candor, which is extremely important. Any organization that is weighed down by having to tiptoe around issues because Bob is overly sensitive or John cries whenever you give him constructive feedback will lose. Organizations like that waste so much time accommodating adolescent emotional needs that the organizations with cultures of candor blow right past them. Another mechanism to avoid or to overcome conflict avoidance, especially culturally, is to have a culture that honors accountability. Now, we all make mistakes, but many cultures, especially corporate cultures, they honor flawless execution above all else, and mistakes are frowned upon and seen as badges of shame. And when there's a heavy emphasis on that and somebody makes a mistake, you can rest assured that they'll be highly motivated to keep that mistake covered up for as long as possible. Now, look, there's nuance here. Quality execution is important and should be honored. But we are human beings, and it is inevitable that we will make mistakes. But one true test of character is how we respond once we recognize that we've made a mistake. So let me tell you about a mistake. As I mentioned years ago, I was an executive at a company called ePrize. It was at a digital promotions company. And one of our clients, we had built and we were maintaining the Pampers loyalty program. Buy Pampers, get the code off the pack, deposit the code in your account, get points, spend points on stuff. A loyalty program. Now, this required that a unique code be printed on every single package of Pampers. We wrote an algorithm that randomly generated millions of these codes. Now, these are 15-character alphanumeric codes. There are only 10 digits, and there are only 26 letters in the alphabet. So when you randomly generate millions of codes, you're going to randomly get real words popping up in them. And sometimes they're nice words like love, cute, or LOL. Sometimes they're not so nice words like hate, die, or ISIS. And when you generate codes like that, there's a best practice, and that is to run codes through a profanity filter before you print them on packages. And without getting into the reasons why, in this case, we didn't do that. And I think some of you may see where this is going. Now imagine the reaction of a young mother who just bought diapers for her little baby girl. And if any of you have ever had the pleasure of holding a little baby girl, you know it's one of the sweetest, purest things in the world. Just this bundle of love and innocence and joy. And the mother looks at the Pampers package. Oh, it's a loyalty program. And she starts inputting her code, JL95T. And then she comes across a 4-letter word that virtually jumps off the product packaging at her. And it wasn't one of the nice words. It was one of the bad ones. And I'm not going to repeat it here, but it is arguably the worst 4-letter word in the English language. And it doesn't start with an S, and it doesn't start with an F. So we end up getting a call from our client. They were pretty upset because they had just gotten a call from this mother who complained that their loyalty program forced her to type this disgusting word into her computer. Now, in a culture that doesn't have candor and doesn't honor accountability, people tend to move into a defensive posture. Well, our contract doesn't say anything about running codes through a profanity filter. You mean you have a profanity filter at Pampers and you didn't run the codes through them before you printed the codes on your products? Seems like you bear a great deal of responsibility here, but we're willing to discuss a reasonable resolution. But in cultures that honor accountability, they embrace conflict. In fact, they see conflict as an opportunity to demonstrate the character of the organization. And they say things like, we are so sorry we have put you in this terrible position. This is on us. This is our fault. And we will do whatever it takes to make it right. Now, we were lucky. Most of the Pampers were still sitting in packages on pallets in the warehouse, hadn't been shipped out yet. But we paid to have all of those diapers broken down and repackaged with proper codes. And then we called up the mother. We explained who we were and that it was our fault. And we gave her a year's supply of Pampers for free. And the client was happy. And they told us, they said, we can't believe how badly you screwed that up. But once it came out, you stepped up, you took responsibility, and we trust you. You had our brand. And we trust that if something happens in the future, you're going to protect us. And ultimately, our relationship with them was so much better than it ever would have been had we executed flawlessly in the first place. So, to recap ways to overcome conflict avoidance. 1, incorporate conflict into the ordinary workflow of an organization. Make it a job requirement. Make it so that when people stay silent, they aren't doing their job. And seek out conflict as an opportunity to build trust and strengthen relationships. And when bad things happen and you step out and are accountable for them, celebrate those examples and show how it works. And those are ways to overcome the avoidance trap. So the 5th and final danger trap of conflict is the judgment trap. A Buddhist healing monk, a little girl named Ling, and a Chinese mafia boss. As crazy as it may sound, Dr. Liu began his medical training at the age of 3, when monks from a nearby Buddhist temple saw in Dr. Liu an extraordinary insight into the human condition, a true talent, a real gift. But they knew that in order for him to reach his maximum potential, he had to start training right away. So they took him, with his parents' permission, to live in the temple, where he remained well into adulthood, and he trained all day, every day, as a Buddhist healing monk. That's actually a picture taken from his room in the temple. When he got older, he also went to medical school and became an MD. a doctor trained in Western medicine, but he views his Western medical training as just a small subset of his overall approach to conflict. That's Dr. Liu. Now, Ling was born in Yanqing, a rural district on the outskirts of Beijing, China. Yanqing is a rural farming community where most people live in poverty. And when Ling was born, she went to live in her grandfather's house with her mother and her father and her paternal grandfather. And when Ling was 3 years old, her mother left, abandoning the family. As you can imagine, that was a great source of conflict for them. And then 2 years later, her father tragically committed suicide. And then her paternal grandfather cared for her for another 6 years until tragedy struck again. And her grandfather was diagnosed with terminal cancer. Now, as you can imagine, her grandfather had a lot of negative judgments toward his former daughter-in-law for abandoning them. But he put that aside and he got word to her to let her know he couldn't care for Ling anymore. And Ling's mother showed up and she said, "Good news, I have a good job in Beijing. I can take her and I can take care of her." So she takes Ling and they go to live in the big city. But as it turns out, there was no job. Ling's mother was a drug addict and a prostitute. She was addicted to crystal meth and God knows what else. And as unthinkable as it is, she sold her daughter into sex slavery to feed her drug habit. Ling was 11 years old. And for the next 2 years, she suffered the worst of humanity. She had to endure unspeakable things. And one day, another prostitute saw Ling and saw that the situation was just wrong for a child to be in that environment. And she told her pimp, who incidentally only used adult prostitutes. And that pimp got word to his boss's 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 boss, all the way up to one of the 4 head mob bosses controlling organized crime in all of Beijing. That mob boss was a patient of Dr. Liu's. So he called up Dr. Liu, told him about Ling. And he said, "If you want to go rescue her, here's her address. You can go there. I'll make sure no one gives you any trouble." So Dr. Liu and a group of people set out to find Ling. And they go to the address, and it's this tiny, dirty apartment with 7 people living in it in just horrible conditions. But they find Ling. And they get to her and they say, "We're here to rescue you and get you out of here." And they take her to a safe place. But Ling was traumatized and she was hysterical. And Dr. Liu had said to the others in the room, he said, why don't you leave for a minute so I can just try to calm her down, get her to stop crying. And as he closes the door behind the last person out of the room and turns back to face Ling, she starts to take off her clothes. And Dr. Liu says, "What are you doing?" And through her tears, she said, "Isn't this what you want?" And that was more than Dr. Liu could take. And he started crying. And then she started crying harder. And then this now 13-year-old girl that they had come to rescue said to Dr. Liu, "It's going to be okay." She wanted to comfort him. And in that moment, Dr. Liu realized he couldn't continue living on this earth without doing something to help people like Ling. So he got Ling into a good family, a safe family that took her in. And it was clean and safe, and she was slowly socialized into a life that was appropriate for a teenage girl in Beijing. And then Dr. Liu went back to his patient and convinced him to call a meeting with the 4 head bosses of the Beijing crime syndicate. That's not a real picture of them because I value my life. I'm not going to show it. And Dr. Liu met with them. Now, it's true one of these men had given Dr. Liu Ling's address and told her about him. But let's not sugarcoat this. These are mob bosses engaged in every imaginable piece of crime. And having witnessed firsthand the human suffering that these men were directly responsible for, Dr. Liu had good reason to judge these men harshly. But he met with them anyway. And in fact, he made them lunch. And Dr. Liu happens to be an excellent cook. I know because I took that picture. He made that food. And after lunch, he made his pitch to the mob bosses to not allow pimps in their organizations to use children. that while it's true there are some disgusting pedophiles who might pay a little more, in the big picture, it just wasn't worth it. And ultimately, he was able to secure a commitment from them that they would not allow their pimps to use children in their prostitution rings. And well, child prostitution, oh, by the way, they even came up with a mechanism, a process to notify Dr. Liu if anybody came across someone caught up in the sex trade. And while child prostitution still exists in Beijing today, it has been dramatically reduced. And at the very least, thousands, if not tens of thousands of children have been spared off the path that Ling was on. Now back to Ling. She was ultimately accepted into a new program that Dr. Liu had created to sponsor children from poverty through high school. It's called Golden Courage. And when kids enter into this program, they give themselves a new name. It's sort of a rite of passage. And she named herself Jinling, which translates to New Hope, because that's how she saw herself and that's how she saw her future. And that organization has a 100% success rate in kids not only graduating high school, but going on to graduate college. And I'm happy to report that today, Ling is a middle school geography teacher, and she's married, and they have a beautiful daughter of their own. And Ling has long since forgiven her mother. In fact, she even tries to help her mother get clean off of drugs in between her jail stints. Before getting married, Ling felt it was important to sit down with her then fiance and tell him about her past. But of course, he loves her without judgment and accepts her, and they are very happy together. Now, why the hell have I told you this story? Well, there's conflict everywhere you turn in this story between mother and daughter, prostitute and pimp, Buddhist monk and mob boss, and so on. And there's a common thread here that we can all take to heart and incorporate into our own lives as we encounter conflict. And that is the role that judgment plays in the creation, escalation, and the barriers to resolution of conflict. Judgment is a huge danger trap of conflict. Now, we all have judgments and preconceived notions about people. Humans are tribal in nature, so we tend to associate ourselves with one group and distinguish ourselves from others. And that tends to create a hierarchy in our minds that puts our group higher up than other groups. So when we encounter someone from another group, we judge them for it. And that's a source of conflict. When someone does something we don't like, we judge them for it. That's a source of conflict. And we know that communication, bad communication, is one of the biggest sources of negative conflict and one of the biggest barriers to resolving it. And our judgments and preconceived notions about people interfere with our ability to communicate effectively. Now, I asked Dr. Liu, how was it? This is a picture of him. How was it that you were able to deal with these pimps and mob bosses? What was your approach? And he explained that because of his training as a healer, he doesn't judge people. He sees people all the time who make bad decisions and lead lifestyles that hurt themselves and hurt others. But he doesn't judge them for it because he's focused on healing. Now, he's very blunt with people, and he will say, the chemicals you're ingesting into your body are killing you, and if you want to live, you have to stop. Or the food you're giving your child is killing her, and if you want her to live, you have to stop. You know, she's not in any danger now, but you're taking decades off of her life. And of course, he says all that with a shopping list voice. Back to pimps and mob bosses, he says, I don't see them as pimps. I just see them as people. I have no fear or anger toward the mob bosses. I'm merely presenting my perspective to them and asking them to share their perspective with me. People are people, and no one is truly better or worse than anyone else. Now, he's a Buddhist monk, and his perspective is deeply rooted into a spiritual belief system. And this isn't the forum, and I'm not the person to preach a spiritual oneness with the universe. But I am focused on conflict and how to leverage it for good. And we know, again, the communication, bad communication causes a lot of conflict. And we know that our judgments and preconceived notions interfere with our ability to communicate effectively. And we also know that while her mother had done terrible things to her daughter, Ling didn't judge her for it. And their relationship is conflict-free. More importantly, Ling is happy. And while those mob bosses did plenty to warrant negative judgment from Dr. Liu, he didn't judge them, he met with them. And many thousands of children were spared as a result. And that's the lesson that we should all take to heart. Because yes, we are human, we do have judgments, but we all have the strength to be able to communicate to others without judgment. And just saying that out loud makes it easier. Being aware of it makes it easier. Our intellectual awareness of our judgment gives us power. Use it to diffuse its impact on conflict. And that is how you overcome the fifth and final danger trap of conflict, the judgment trap. So we went through the 5 danger traps of conflict. First, we talked about the bully trap. We saw how Uma Thurman and Quentin Tarantino fell into that trap, and it led to really bad results that put Uma Thurman in physical danger and caused some permanent injuries. And we saw that ways to overcome the bully trap is to dispassionately make people aware of our concerns. Use the shopping list voice. Regardless of whether you're perceived as the bully or being bullied, that works. That brings things down and it diffuses it. Second trap, in the need to win trap, where I got caught up in needing to win for winning's sake. And I was just lucky the judge was there to save me. But we saw how emotion is really a weakness that can drive conflict into unproductive, even destructive territory. And that once we have awareness of that, we can overcome it. Third, the liar trap, where we saw Hooters got in a lot of hot water trying to pass off a Yoda doll for a car. And the avoidance trap, and we see how when you can incorporate the initiation of conflict into the ordinary workflow and have a culture of candor and accountability, that's how you can pull an organization out of the conflict avoidance trap. And then finally, the judgment trap, where even a little girl like Ling was able to overcome it. So my challenge for you is that at some point in the next week or two, either you or someone you're dealing with will start getting pulled into one of these traps. But the challenge is to recognize it in the moment. You don't even have to call it out to the other person. Just be aware of the fact that you are in the trap. And that presence of mind will give you intellectual awareness and use it to overcome it. So now that we're armed with these things and these tools, let's harness conflict to drive results. And let's lean into conflict to make the changes we want in our lives. And let's master conflict to control our destiny. Thank you.